good morning. My name's Angus Kennedy from the Institute of Ideas, and this session is called Why Luther Still Matters, Religious Conscience and Individual Liberty. Obviously, it's a big anniversary, big birthday for the Reformation coming up, and I think we can examine, and the panel will have their own take on what's really important about the Reformation, what was at stake at the time, and what does it mean for us now? Are there still an important legacy of the Reformation, or is it possible that some of the gains of the Reformation in terms of individual liberty and conscience are now at threat from new forms of secular orthodoxy? To discuss these, and I'll introduce the panel in the order they're going to speak. On my immediate left, Kate Maltby. She's an associate fellow at Bright Blue and a trustee of Index and Censorship, a critic and columnist as well. Second to speak, on my right, Dolan Cummings. Dolan's the author of an existentialist crime novel, if you can imagine such a thing, called The Existential Leap. He's an associate fellow, ex-colleague of mine at the Institute of Ideas, and also the co-founder of the Manifesto Club, which campaigns to stop restrictions of freedom in public life. Third to speak, on Dolan's right, is Professor Aaqil Ahmed. He's a columnist at Arab Weekly, but also the former head of religion and ethics at the BBC and Channel 4. And then to speak fourth, on my far left, John O'Brien, who's the president of the US-based institution campaigning group Catholics for Choice. Kate, if you'd like to get the ball rolling.
Yeah, thank you very much, Angus. I'm delighted to be here. I think I've been largely invited as a columnist and a critic, and I'm afraid, like Luther, someone who's spending a long time on a graduate thesis on the Reformation. But what you may not know is that I feel I'm here as the former undergraduate producer of a 2007 viral video entitled 95 Theses, but a Pope Ain't One. Those of you who know your Jay-Z will have got the joke, and presumably no one else will. But, of course, the Pope wasn't initially Luther's problem. I mean, we're going to be talking a lot here about Luther today as a marker for individual conscience, as someone who ushered in a whole new way of thinking, but I think it's very important when we talk historically about the Reformation, that we talk about a time of new ideas emerging, left, right, and centre, the invention of the printing press, obviously, in the late 15th century, already creating a new era of discourse and critique of authority structures such as the Catholic Church. Erasmus, of course, was 16 years Luther's senior, had been a major force in encouraging an internal reformation within the Catholic Church, also a hugely important translator. Now, because I'm speaking first and I'm been asked to get the ball rolling, I am going to be giving potted bio of Luther. I think it's important someone throws in the sort of starting facts. Those of you who know a lot more about Luther than even I do, let alone what I can say in 3 minutes left, my apologies. But I mean, Luther is someone who emerges in this era from a lower middle class background. His father in particular is keen that he progress in the new era. He's a law school dropout, which should also give more of us a lot of hope about what we can do in later life. He was 34 when his first real intellectual achievement, the 95 Theses, is published, which is definitely giving me hope at this moment. But he always has this personality as a troublemaker. I mean, he walks out on his father famously when he drops out of law school. And there is another conversation to be had that all historians have about whether or not these great historical changes emerge from general intellectual climate or really obstinate human beings being born with a particularly difficult and impressive personality, as Luther quite clearly did. What kickstarts the 95 Theses, as many of you will know, is the visit by Johann Tetzel to Wittenberg to start selling indulgences. Effectively, I mean, what Luther and his fellows would have criticised as the church allowing you to buy your way out of purgatory. Of course, this is all in to support the great project of Leo X, the creation of St. Peter's Basilica. And many of you will have heard how Luther characterized this particular corruption on the part of the Catholic Church. Probably not something Johann Tetzel actually ever said in advertising indulgences, but the famous line in German, "Sobald der Pfennig im Kasten klingt, die Selle aus dem Fegfeuer springt," roughly translated as soon as the penny drops in the coffer, the soul, as soon as the penny in the coffer rings, the soul out of purgatory springs. And this becomes the sort of thrust of Luther's first complaint against the Catholic Church, that it's a corrupt institution, that it's an institution that allows the powerful and the wealthy to get ahead, even spiritually. He doesn't really talk much about the Pope in the 95 Theses, except in Thesis 86, where he talks about the Pope's wealth, and he says that the Pope is as rich as Crassus, why can't he pay for the Basilica himself? I'm going to make two brief reminders as to why Luther's a difficult person for us in the 21st century to look to as an example of freedom of conscience, and then go into the issues as to why he might still be a free speech hero. So, one of the most important things about Luther's 95 Theses, but also about what he starts publishing next in 1520 and 1522, is that he is, of course, famously all about asserting the right of secular authorities to control the church in their own land. Famously, we get here this with Henry VIII. But in 1520, Luther is writing his address to the Christian nobility of the German nation, which is basically a plea bargain. He's excommunicated in 1521. He needs those German princes' support. And in 1522, he's really developing the Two Kingdoms doctrine, which is a sort of crucial Lutheran doctrine, which argues that God rules the mortal world through two arms. The first is the arm of the secular state, that it is incumbent on princes and politicians. Sorry, that's my timer telling me to stop. Incumbent on princes and politicians to enforce godliness through the law courts, through secular authority. The other kingdom is the kingdom of grace. Luther is of course, famously developing his doctrine of justification by faith, which imposes the burden on the individual conscience, but also celebrates the concept of God's grace as the instrument through which personal faith can be justified. So there are these two routes to salvation, effectively, one through a godly state and one through a godly soul, and neither of them involve a pope or an independent church. That doesn't make him a free speech hero, as many of you who will know the history of Protestant tortures and Protestant civil repression will know. On the other hand, I think there are two other things briefly which we should be talking about today. The first is the idea of Luther, of course, as a personal example, as a great rebel. That has, some would say, been slightly overblown. Famously, at the Diet of Worms in 1521, Luther is offered the chance to recant before being permanently an enemy of the Catholic Church. It is alleged that he faced down the great accusers of the Catholic Church and he said, "Here I stand, I can do no other, God help me," which has come down as the sort of ultimate expression of the Protestant conscience fighting against the Pullman-esque authority of the Catholic Church. There's a lot of disagreement about whether he actually said that, but what is important is that if he did, he was standing in front of his huge pile of books, and I will finish in a minute, huge pile of books which he presented, which he brought as his sources to the Diet of Worms. Luther is someone who holds up Bibles and points at texts when he argues. His conscience is not one that springs from an individual internal intellect as he presents it, but from a return to the book, the text, as the ultimate source of authority. And when we think about Lutheran free speech and conscience, we should be thinking about what it means for society to move back to looking at the printed word and revelation, divine revelation, as in many ways an unquestionable source of authority. And from that, and I'll leave it here, we have seen through the Enlightenment and now to the modern and the postmodern age, a shifting number of debates about what authority means. I mean, what Luther's great achievement was to critique the authority of the interpreters, the hermeneutic class, if you like, who took as their privilege in an era of the Bible in Latin the opportunity to translate, the opportunity to communicate and interpret and present that text to the rest of us. And of course, Luther, banging the drum for the Bible in the vernacular, took that power and that privilege back to the individual subject, the interior soul, the single reader. on the other hand, there is, and I think many of us would argue that destruction of authority has led us exactly to where we are now, where, I mean, my other job is as a theatre critic, which, just to use as an example, used to be a position of established authority, for better or worse. It was, there were arbiters, there was a critical class in many other fields, in football commentary and everything. We are now living in a world in which the idea of expert criticism is seen as deeply elitist, and this goes back to other debates we've had all year. And actually, I blame Martin Luther, and I will leave it on that before we have the whole debate. I blame Martin Luther for getting us to the point where none of us are really allowed to be an authority on anything anymore.
That's very good, Kate. I think that puts two important things on the table about what matters from Luther. One is this sort of tension that he introduces between secular authority, the rule of the princes, and on the other hand, setting the spiritual realm free, so removing the price of the soul. And the other one is this relationship and challenge that goes out to authority, getting the experts and intermediaries out of the way, allowing people to have direct relationship to authority, the big authority in this case of God. But, as Kate says, it becomes a question of authority as such. Dolan, your thoughts?
I think it's interesting to note that in British culture, the great figure of conscience was traditionally not so much Martin Luther as Thomas More, the faithful Catholic who refused to go along with Henry VIII's annulment and remarriage. And it's interesting because I would argue that he serves as a good model of conscience, not despite being a Catholic in what became a predominantly Protestant country, but actually because he's a Catholic. I think in the British liberal tradition, we're kind of more comfortable with other people's consciences. I respect your strongly held feelings that I don't really want to entertain myself. That's the kind of politically liberal view that we have, and there's many good things about it. But there's a certain distance from the conscience itself. When we think about religion today, we almost always talk about Islam because Islam tends to be more strongly held. I think Luther wouldn't really have recognized that idea of other people's consciences being all that important. And in fact, his journey began not with a settled conscience, the kind of here I stand thing, but with an incredibly troubled conscience. As Kate mentioned, I think his major idea or recovery, as he thought, was the idea of justification by faith. So the church did teach that Christians went to heaven not because they deserved it, but because Jesus had died on their behalf. The idea is that nobody could really earn heaven. But then nonetheless, the church did say that sinners could do their bit and required them to take part in the sacraments, to offer up money for the church, of course, to do their best, to do what is in you, was what they said. And to a certain kind of personality, that sounds fine. Yeah, okay, I'll try to be a good person, and then God will do the rest. That's all fine. Luther didn't have that kind of personality. He had the kind of personality of someone who tortured himself incessantly about, am I doing enough? Am I doing the right things? Am I right with God? And he felt God was just this really angry, judgmental figure that he could never possibly placate. And yet the church was teaching him that he did have to do something to placate God. I think one way to understand that in more secular terms now is that Islam in most forms prohibits alcohol. You're not supposed to drink alcohol at all. Christianity, of course, you can drink alcohol, there's wine in the Bible and so on, but you're told not to get drunk. And a certain type of personality thinks, oh, that's fine, I'll just have a drink and not get drunk. Another type of personality, like Luther, says, well, how much do I get to drink before it counts as drunk? And you can agonize over a question like that, which means that you're kind of missing the point, that there's an element of faith there. But Luther didn't seem to worry about how much beer he drank. That was not a problem. But he was worried about his relationship with God. He didn't feel that he was right with God. And so this was something that tortured him. He felt deeply convicted as a sinner. If anyone who's read anything by him will see that. But he came to this idea, particularly in Paul's letter to the Romans, that justification is by faith alone. There's actually nothing that you have to do, nothing you can do. It's kind of impertinent of you to think that there's anything you could possibly do to placate God. So the idea is that Jesus did it all on the cross. All you have to do is believe, and then the Holy Spirit helps you out in a living response. This is the kind of idea. And so it's a hugely liberating idea, away from this idea that there's something he's got to do to placate God, to know actually he's all right, he's right with God, and all Christians are. So to him that was a liberation. And I think genuinely, he wasn't just concerned about his own conscience, his own soul. He had pastoral concerns about his people, and he wanted them to have the same liberation. So when he probably didn't say, here I stand, as Kate said, but he, I think on firmer ground where he said something like, my conscience is captive to the word, and to go against conscience is neither right nor safe. And that brings us to a much more classic, almost like a Thomas More understanding of conscience, that it is settled. Look, I know what I need to believe, I know what I need to do, and I'm going to stick with it. I'm not going to be swayed by anyone else, however powerful they might be. It was very much externally oriented. He was preaching, he was writing. It wasn't about hiding away and saying, this is what I believe. And at no point did he say anything like, I can no longer be part of an organization that teaches or does X, Y, Z. You know, he didn't want to leave the church, he wanted to transform the church. And that was because he wanted to bring that message to others, and for others to feel the liberation that he had felt, and to live as contented Christians. So I would argue that perhaps the enduring legacy of Luther and of this idea of religious conscience is not so much the right to have your own little conscience in a corner somewhere, but actually the right to tell other people what they should do and what they should think, without coercion. You know, it was always the idea that people should be persuaded by resort to Scripture and common reason, not by coercion. But it was very much, you know, he wasn't content just to be right himself. He wanted to convince others. He wanted the whole church to see what he saw. So the famous sola scriptura, by Scripture alone, people often make the qualification, sola scriptura is not solo scriptura. It's not just that you sit on your own and think, I think it means this or that. That there is, in good faith, a real message there that Christians can argue over, but that there is something, you know, the faith is that there is some ultimate truth there that isn't just about an individual. So while individual conscience is a very important outcome, I think a few centuries on before we really worked that out, I think it is much more of an externally oriented idea of him saying, this is what everyone else should believe. This is what I'm putting out there and what I'm trying to convince people of. And I think it's, in a sense, it's quite a political development, and something which is worth affirming today.
Yeah, it's sort of taking the authority for telling truth down to the level of the individual.
Yeah, but with the emphasis on the truth, not the individual.
Yeah, precisely. Aaqil, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I'm going to pick up on that actually and bring it more up to date, and just look at something that just a few little observations and points which hopefully we'll be able to discuss later on. One of them is actually just a Pew Study which was released just a few weeks ago. It was released in August 2017, which looked at Protestants in America, and it's just under, I think it's like 46% of US Protestants who say faith alone is needed to attain salvation, which is quite an interesting thing, because, you know, it's a key plank, as we've just been listening to, it's a key plank of what actually Lutheran Reformation, which would obviously lead to Protestantism, would actually say, but actually only 46% believe that. But half, 52%, believe that good deeds and faith are needed to get into heaven, which obviously, you know, historically a Catholic kind of trait. So there's an interesting thing there going on that actually you would imagine that's obviously, you know, it's split, things are different. Luther therefore doesn't have any kind of relevance to the world that we live in today. Now, when you further go into this data, it says here, most US Christians, i.e. 60%, do not accept the idea that the Bible can be the sole source of religious guidance for Christians, saying instead that in addition to Scripture, Christians also need religious guidance from the church, teachings and tradition. And quite interesting as well, actually, when they drill down further into this, it says the view that both the Bible and church traditions are necessary for guidance is expressed by most Catholics, that's 75% of them, by black Protestants, 67%, and by white mainline Protestants, 61%. And then the reason why I'm going on about this is that we then go on to white evangelical Protestants, where it's slightly different. So the balance of opinion amongst white evangelical Protestants leans in the other direction. 58% say the Bible does indeed provide all the religious guidance that Christians need. So therefore, there is a resurgence of, you could argue, some of the key drivers of Luther and that whole revolution of that period, And it's happening again, once again, within white evangelical Christians, if you look at the definition of white evangelical Christians in America. So it's quite interesting. They seem to be very different to the rest of the Christians, not just around the world, but particularly in America. So there's quite an interesting thing there that we could pick up on. An interesting other thing as well is obviously when we look at the belief of white evangelical Christians, which is more in line with what we would generally think of in times of religion today, so the other believers, the Catholics, the black Protestants, the mainline Protestants, that there's a dilution of the fundamentals. So we're bringing in a more enlightened view, more humanistic view. So people saying that there are different ways that you can be a better person, that you can be more, as we said, more in the Catholic tradition for the time of Luther, that effectively by being a better Christian will enable you to get into heaven. Your only need for being a Christian, you don't necessarily have to find everything within the Bible. The Reformation and the conflict that it unleashed at that time, because let's remember that the conflict that comes after the Reformation is quite brutal and bloody, and ultimately leads us through all that period to the tolerance that we have today, that we see in Western Europe in particular, and the act of tolerance and all those things that come with it. And that's quite an interesting thing, because what it enables you to do is, obviously, it enables you to have, over a period of time, the ability to have an accommodation, an acceptance of other people's belief. And you could even argue, going even further, that acceptance and that toleration of other people's belief is what marks out maybe the Protestant Reformation and what happens after, in the centuries after, in Britain, to be very different to what happens in the rest of the world, particularly in the rest of Europe. And you may even be able to look at this when you think about what happens with regards to anti-Semitism. That accommodation that we seem to have in the UK enables us to be way more tolerant than you may have seen in other parts of Europe in the 19th and 20th century. And you could even argue, to go on to see that when you look at Islamophobia today, in Britain, it's very different to the Islamophobia that you would see in other parts of Europe. In other parts of Europe, there seems to be an obsession with particular aspects of faith. Whereas in Britain, you could argue that it's less about particular aspects of faith and more the Islamophobia we see comes more from what we would call as a classic tradition of race relation politics. So very different to, again. So maybe there is something to pick up there on our own interpretation of the Reformation in Britain and what it has enabled us to be in terms of tolerance. And then one last point, which is actually quite an interesting thing, which is actually it just seems that the timing was relevant for this conversation, and that is the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia talking about returning Saudi Arabia, which is quite interesting thing, returning Saudi Arabia to a more tolerant form of Islam. Well, it's fascinating, because if you imagine the relationship that Luther and the Protestant reformers of that period wanted to have with the church and the state and belief, etc., it's probably very similar to the kind of relationship that you already have today with regards to the mainstream Sunni interpretation of theology, and particularly with the hardline Saudi Arabian theology that we've lived with for many decades. So if there is going to be some kind of modern day aspect to what Luther can mean for Islam, etc., it will be the opposite. What we're going to have to see is actually not a Reformation along the lines of, say, the Protestant Reformation, but a Reformation which actually would be more along the lines of a counter-Reformation. So it's just quite an interesting fact that at this particular moment in time we have the potential. I mean, you could argue, those of us who've worked in Saudi Arabia or with Saudi Arabia, that it's going to be quite difficult to implement, but the potential for a modern-day Reformation happening in front of us, but it's going to be very different. It's going to be the opposite of it. So those are just a few points I thought, that just to bring it up to date and see with regards to what Luther means today, with a few little things that are happening around the world.
Brilliant. I think there's some things we can come back to there in terms of the English Reformation, and also the nature of contemporary tolerance in society, and aspects to which there is also some intolerance, and what that relationship is to the Reformation. But John, your thoughts?
Thank God for Luther. I say that as an Irish Catholic. The 16th century Reformation movement was about more than just theological disagreement. It helped create the conditions for the final unraveling of medieval authority. Nation states and real political parties were to emerge from the ashes of old religious authority. Differences of opinion led to religious wars. which led to maybe the idea of a secular peace, the idea that if we don't live together, we're going to die together. I think what Luther gave us, first of all, was the idea that the human person needed to be defined differently. Authority and integrity of the individual. And I think that that was immensely important. Second of all, I think Luther had the idea that you don't need a visa from the Vatican to visit with God. And I think that that was incredibly revolutionary thought at the time. So if Luther didn't exist, we'd probably have to invent him. And sometimes I feel that we do invent Luther. Revolutionary? Maybe not so much. You know that his thesis was submitted to an academic committee of the Catholic Church. Now, that's not as romantic as the idea of nailing anything to a door somewhere. The idea that his rejection, the peasants' revolt of 1524, was greatly inspired by Luther, and yet he originally condemned the peasants and the nobles, and in the end he sided with the nobles, describing the peasants as mad dogs doing the devil's work. So the idea that he had this sort of perfect respect for conscience, probably not so true. While he inspired Anglicanism, you could say, that's sort of nice, he also inspired Calvinism, which led to, Oliver Cromwell sending us Irish to hell or to Connacht. Preferably hell was the one that a lot of Irish people experienced. So the idea that Protestantism had this tolerance in and of itself is not true. I do think, though, that a very important, Luther maybe was more a catalyst than a creator. The printing press is probably equally as important for the idea of spreading ideas and freedom. But Luther did get some of that going by questioning authority. The idea about speaking truth to power, I think Luther did that in one way or another, and I think that that led to great things. One of the problems that I have, though, in the legacy of Luther is the idea that in some way Luther created conscience, the idea of conscience. Well before Luther, who I think is falsely hyped as a champion of freedom of conscience, was Thomas Aquinas. And drawing from the insights of John and Paul, the apostles, not the Beatles, he gave a powerful defense of individual conscience. This put emphasis on the rights of individual conscience that is unparalleled, in my opinion, in any religious tradition known to me. The primacy was with conscience, not with church authority, and not with the Bible. So in other words, Aquinas was saying it's that internal moral compass within you and your relationship with God that matters, not the Bible. So it's sort of Protestants plus one. And I think that tradition was there within Catholicism before Luther drew a special attention to it. I think the reason why conscience is important today, and I thought it was very interesting with Rees-Mogg recently coming out and saying that he disagreed with abortion, but he was not going to make abortion illegal. And I think the idea, I greatly admire that, because there he is saying that he disagrees. His conscience tells him it's wrong, but he's going to respect the consciences of other people in their moral decision-making. And I think that that is a very Catholic position, just as it is with Catholics here in the UK. In 2012, 39% of British Catholics thought abortion should be legal on the simple grounds that the woman does not wish to have a child. Now, today, fully 61% of British Catholics think that. And I see that as not deserting tradition, not being a bad Catholic. I see that as people following their consciences. And long may we continue in the tradition that's Aquinas and that is Luther of following our consciences.
Thanks, John. Before we leap off Luther, I mean, absolutely Aquinas, but obviously, Augustine as well. I mean, he's no great lover of freedom, the Luther that we're hearing about here, but nonetheless, he does do something very liberatory, I think, in that he sets the soul or the conscience off limits to any form of temporal authority. And he wrote in 1520 that temporal authority cannot harm the soul. So he gives the soul, liberates it and gives it moral authority against any form of authority, really, apart from God's. But at the same time, and as John's saying with the peasants thing, he's demanding unconditioning obedience to secular authority, to the princes. And there's a sort of contradiction that he puts in play, I mean, he doesn't put it in play. He represents a constellation of sort of forces that are happening at the time. There is real secular authority to the secular power of the papacy happening at the same time with German princes and so on. But there's that real tension in play between your inner life being liberated from external authority, but your public life being coerced by secular authority. And I just want people to come back on that point before we sort of leap off Luther into how that may play out in the contemporary realm. Kate, is there anything you want to say on that, or anything else? You were strong on the authority point of the text and so on.
Well, yes, it was there I wanted to leap back and respond. On Aquinas and on Augustine, I completely agree that those traditions of individual conscience and celebrating the individual conscience have been expressed by the Catholic Church's most prominent early figures. However, just to come back as a literary critic, if you look at the literary history of the Middle Ages and you look at the history of a manuscript, the idea of an author, the idea of an individual author of a literary work is not something that emerges until you get the Reformation. On a purely practical level, the monastic texts that survive to us today are palimpsests. They have multiple authors. They are traditions created by communities where someone will come in and write 100 pages of biblical crit, and then another hand will take over. And the author page, there is no author page, but the book will be attributed to the monks of blah-de-blah monastery. There will be annotations, additions, scribblings in the margins by multiple hands, and the product is one text. What you get after Luther, and this is as much about the printing press as it is about Luther, I will accept that, is that title page, is the idea of the book. It's been put together in one publisher. You have a figure of authority who is an individual, maybe a celebrity author. Erasmus is a big part of this as well, because he promotes himself. Erasmus is the first self-made public intellectual. He writes all of these letters to his own political patrons, begging to be allowed to dedicate his book to them and saying it's really important and I will come and be your star lecturer at your court. And he's creating this celebrity circuit for the author for the first time. That's something that's happening in the 16th century. I think Luther's a big part of that. And it creates the modern author as the individual figure of authority, which I think is at least as important as Aquinas or Augustine writing on the individual conscience however many centuries back.
John?
Yeah. I think one of the things that I'm interested in raising is Aquinas was greatly attacked and persecuted for speaking out about conscience by the Catholic hierarchy. And I find it just amazing that recently the Catholic hierarchy in the United States are talking about how their consciences are being impinged, how their religious freedom is under threat. It's all under threat because they want to be able to take taxpayer money and not provide the services people need. So take money for HIV, but not give people condoms. Or look after refugees without giving them emergency contraception. Or they said that as part of the Affordable Care Act, contraceptives are made available of no charge to people who are poor in the United States. The bishops are against workers in Catholic institutions, hospitals, schools, getting access to contraception. They want to be able to block that. All because they're saying that their consciences are impinged when workers, through health insurance, get access to contraception. So I find it interesting how the bishops are misusing the idea of conscience, claiming it for themselves as institutions, rather than consciences actually resting as it should with individuals.
I think there's an important angle to maybe explore as we go through this. There can be some sort of victim pleading, identity politics status around Christian claims that have their conscience is being impinged on these days, because that's the way everything is going, I'm afraid. Everybody says, I need some support from the state because I'm not allowed to do X, Y, and Z. The Christian identity politics is something to be aware of in this discussion. Aaqil, did you want to come back on any of these points, and then Dolan, and then we'll go out to the floor?
I think it's all been covered, to be honest with you, because I think the reality is we know that the printing press was a key driver in most of this, and that there was, and the one thing as well, obviously Luther takes a lot of the credit, but of course he's not the only thing. And for many of us, it's the people who worked post-Luther, I suppose, in terms of the people who were working really hard to make the Bible available into the vernacular language, for in English, in Dutch or in German, whichever language it was available. And so I suppose ultimately, the world that we live in today, yes, it's been shaped by Luther, but he couldn't have got there on his own, and he definitely couldn't have got there without the printing press.
Nobody's actually said it explicitly, but the German Bible is Luther's translation, right?
Yeah.
So that is he not only created Protestantism, if you like, but he created the German language, which is not bad for a day's work. Dolan.
Yeah, into the printing press I would add the pulpit, because the Reformation was also driven by preaching. I mean, and preaching was a very important idea to the Protestants in a way that hadn't been in the medieval Catholic Church. You went to church and they did Mass in Latin, and it was a sacrifice that they did for God. That was something Luther very much objected to. He saw the church service as being for the congregants, and the preacher would talk to them in their own language about stuff that was important, and actually preach the religion, so that they were expected to understand it in a way that the medieval Catholics probably didn't really understand much about theology. And that's the interesting point about the justification. There's technically that thing about justification by, or I think the question was salvation by faith alone. And without being pedantic, justification is not the same as salvation. The problem that Luther had with Catholicism was that you kind of earned justification through the process of sanctification. And he said, no, justification comes first. You're all right, you're fine, now be good. I kind of compare it to the difference between a parent saying to the child, I love you, now be good. And saying, be good, and then I'll decide if you're worthy of my love. And so there's the kind of huge relief that experienced by putting justification first. But then sanctification is still part of the process of salvation. It's a little bit mysterious how all this works out. But I think it's important because it's very difficult to get away from the common sense folk understanding. If you've got heaven and hell, then the good people go to heaven and the bad go to hell. And that's not what Christianity teaches at all. We're all bad people. And so that's what Jesus is all about. But the thing about getting justification out of the way kind of means that you're no longer worrying about placating God through Mass or through anything that you do. And that kind of opens up a secular space, because it means that suddenly your life is your own in a way that it perhaps wasn't before, certainly for someone like Luther. I mean, certainly kind of highly strung intellectual types, this is much more deeply felt than for everyone else, but nonetheless, they were the ones who led it. And it did create this sense that, and then particularly Calvin, but also Luther would say that everything is a calling. It's not that the priests are doing something special and monks are doing something special and the rest of it are just sort of waste of space. But that in doing your own business and working and raising a family, you were doing important stuff. And so that kind of validated everyday life in a sense. And that's what takes us to, it's very hugely controversial, Weber's thesis that the Reformation leads to capitalism in some sense, but there's something in it in the sense of the secular space being opened up. Yeah.
My question is triggered partly by the early remarks about Erasmus and subsequently about internal reformers, and it's all usually more complex than the simple answers, and as you've implied, it's all more complex. What was the relationship between the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, and between internal reformers within both and diehards on both sides? I mean, how did the two sides interact among their own wings, and indeed across the boundaries, if it was the boundaries, with each other? Thank you.
In Luther's preface to his small catechism, he speaks very strongly about how the common people don't know anything about theology, they don't know anything about the Bible, they don't know the Ten Commandments, they don't know the Lord's Prayer, and for his preachers to go out and actually teach people things. How would you see Luther, his practices like this, influencing what education would be in the future?
All the panelists have said things which skate round the idea in a way of free speech. And I wonder if you think that in the Reformation a sort of free speech community was being created. Someone mentioned Calvin, whose work I know more than Luther, but Calvin said things about, say, holy relics that by the standards of the day were completely blasphemous, and people, I think, should go and read them because they're hilarious. He was funny about sacred things. The print as part of the Reformation opened up that space so that people could do that kind of thing. Now we come to the present day, we've just got this incontinent chattering all the time on social media. People sometimes talking as though these are matters of conscience. You know, they deeply want you to know that the EU was invented by Jews in the 19th century and it's a plot to swamp Europe with Muslims and that kind of thing. And they clearly seem to believe this, but a lot of them don't have the courage of their convictions that people in the Reformation had. They hide behind anonymity very often. Luther, Erasmus, Calvin weren't hiding behind anonymity. They were putting themselves in harm's way. And I wonder if the reason people don't put themselves in harm's way now is that they don't think they'll actually get support for free speech from the people who read their ideas, even if they disagree with them.
Angus, you mentioned the fact that there was a lot of Bible translation going on in England as well as in Germany. But there's a whole culture that was developing before the Reformation. You have in people's own languages, romantic literature, which was very challenging to what you might call orthodox behaviour, particularly on the sexy side of things. And so you have, I think perhaps you could perhaps relate that to the Renaissance, but you had a whole cultural development that was going on that coincided, maybe even have stimulated the Reformation, rather than the Reformation stimulating the other thing. I think that actually did precede the Reformation, particularly in French culture.
Moving around lectures and discussions, we've heard a lot this weekend about disruption and the creative power of disruption. And I was wondering whether, thinking about justification through faith, yes, it can give you an immense sense of security, or it can completely disrupt your life because, am I faithful enough? And once that disruption has been introduced into the mix, it frees people up, I think this has been said, to think for themselves. You have to always look at your own conscience. Am I saved? Am I justified through faith? So it's not really a question, it's an observation that whatever else Luther is or is not, huge anti-Semite friend to power, he is one of the great disruptors in Western civilization. And from that disruption flows enlightenment and individual conscience.
Aaqil, anything you'd like to come back on or develop?
Yeah, it's on the social media aspect. I mean, it's quite interesting because, I mean, the difference, I suppose, really is that, you know, when you think about the individuals involved, whether it be Luther or Tyndale or Cranmer or Wycliffe or any of these, and it goes a little bit with the literature point as well, is that these were the reason why they put their mark on it and say this is me and this is what, because they really believed in something. They're not a bunch of fruitcakes with crazy ideas or misogynists or racists or Islamophobes or anti-Semites. Well, they may be all of those in little bits as well, you know, without one, you know, we can libel them now if it doesn't matter. But the thing is, they were martyrs. They believed in something that they felt was worth dying for. That's something that was really important, that was actually would make a huge difference. And that's, I suppose, the real difference between now in terms of these individuals. And in terms of the belief that they wanted to change. They did want to change the world. They were great disruptors, and they would do anything, you know, whether it meant, you know, even being burnt alive or being killed or whatever it would be, or living the life of. If you think about the things that they did at that time, not just, I know we're talking about Luther today, but not just Luther, but the other individuals involved. I mean, the way they behaved, it's espionage. It's you know, you could draw parallels with the fight with our war against terrorism, etc. Because these people were effectively behaving they were going against the state. They were trying to bring the state down, but either whether they wanted to or it was a unintended consequence of what they believed in. But the fact of the matter is, they wanted to change the world around them, so they were really, really brave. And you're right, you know, in terms of the literature that existed around it, they changed the world. I mean, Tyndale gave us more words than Shakespeare. He's possibly one of the most important, influential figures in Britain, but yet, apart from the fact I've made 2 films on him, but the fact of the matter is, apart from those 2 films, there's very little known or talked about in schools, etc. We don't talk about him in schools as much as we probably should do. We don't know enough about him, but these are great disruptors. These are great people who, you're right, would have gone on, the journey had started, but they were part of a bigger journey. And the printing press, I started off life as a graphic designer, I worked on the printing presses that weren't very much different. This sounds awful now, but they weren't very much different to the Wittenberg press. You know, they were I worked with hot metal and with gum arabic and all those things in the mid to late 80s. It still existed until the 90s. So the fact of the matter is, the things that they gave us, we lived with for a long time, and we have somehow forgotten just how relevant they were, and we've focused this whole conversation around a couple of individuals or one individual or one particular moment that probably never happened. But like in all these aspects, a whole series of important martyrs, freedom fighters, terrorists, whatever you want to call them, all of these people had to exist, and they existed, and they gave us the world we live in today. And I think to in any way think that they can be talked about in the same breath as the idiots that I have to deal with, or many of us have to deal with on social media, I think I understand the point, but the fact is, these people really meant something, and that's why we're talking about Luther, but we should be talking about more people as well.
Well, you raised an important point, though, or allude to an issue, maybe. We don't do a lot of teaching of our Christian history in school anymore. I mean, when I was a boy, we still sung hymns, but I don't think that goes on much anymore.
No, we don't, no, and you know, I think I said, when it comes to Tyndale, I mean, Tyndale is this incredible character that we seem somehow has just been bypassed. No one knows who he is. And I remember having to explain who Tyndale was when I was at Channel 4 when we first made the first film about the Bible. I think we called it the Bible Martyrs, and we told the story of Wycliffe, Cameron, Tyndale, and then did Tyndale with Melvyn Bragg at the BBC. And one of the programs that I didn't manage to sell, but they eventually made it, and I think it went out a couple of weeks ago, which was the one on the free books, etc. You know, so he was back in again. So the fact of the matter is, you can have an obsessive like me who may have made that happen, but the fact of the matter is that you're right. We don't learn enough, and I think that's because we have lived for the last century or so in what we call post-Christian Europe. But the fact of the matter is, the rest of the world doesn't live in post-Christian Europe, and the rest of the world now lives with us, and the rest of the world, because of digital technology, we have access to them. So the fact of the matter is, our poor religious literacy is why we have no idea who Tyndale is, because we've been told he's no longer important. Many years ago, we were told these people weren't important. But the fact of the matter is, they are, and religion still is important.
Dolan, what do you think?
Yeah, it's true that Tyndale, Luther, and Calvin were all quite instrumental in the development of English, French, and German languages. I mean, Calvin wrote in Latin and translated into French. But I guess it's interesting because there wasn't really a uniform language in any of those countries. You know, language was much more diverse and regionalized and so on. And the Reformation did kind of give us a step towards nations. You know, no longer the Bible in Latin, and then you've got the local over here. There's some mediating structure suddenly. Among many other more complicated factors, of course. But it's that idea of putting people back in, rather than having religion being something that is done by a caste of priests. Just on the free speech point, I think the notion of free speech is kind of anachronistic around the Reformation, because nobody really, you know, few outliers around the Renaissance and Reformation kind of touted something like we would recognize as free speech, but for the most part, people didn't want anyone else, didn't want heretics writing or speaking. So people always make the point about Calvin and Geneva having the heretic Servetus killed, as if he wouldn't have been killed in any other European city. You know, he was already under a death sentence. So it was kind of a test. Like, will the Genevites tolerate him? Will you tolerate any kind of heresy? You deny the Trinity, which was very naughty. But I think now, looking back, we think, well, actually, why don't you just let people say whatever you want? And if your argument is stronger, if your references to Scripture are more convincing, then you'll win. I mean, it's sort of common sense now, but it really wasn't common sense at the time. The idea was, if you tolerated this kind of dissent, it was a sign of weakness rather than strength. So I think the fact that we flipped that around is very important, but it was part of the long history that the Reformation opened up.
Kate?
Well, I was going to talk about Geneva too. I was actually born in Geneva, and my mother, for the first few years of my life, took me regularly to the Church of Scotland. It was a good Presbyterian, where John Knox preached. And I was very much brought up with the idea that I was fortunate enough to be part of a city that had a long history of being a place of free speech exiles. And actually, in the main bell tower in the old town in Geneva, where Calvin would give his pronouncements to the town, there is now an inscription saying, Genève, cité de refuge. It is the place of refuge. And then, of course, I grew up and I started hearing about what happened if you denied the Trinity in Geneva in the Reformation. And yes, you probably got thrown into the river, or all kinds of other things happened to you. But one thing we haven't really talked about, I think, is the rise of cities in the Reformation, which is, again, something like the printing press, which Luther's not responsible. There are other economic factors going on. But I think in this same period, we begin to see the rise of the metropolis as an independent body where the slightly more repressive powers that be may not be able to reach you, partly because city living is more anonymous. But that is essential for the creation of something that looks like modern free speech. I agree that the term free speech is utterly anachronistic, in that Luther believed there were heresies. It's just that the Catholic Church was the one propagating them. There is, as we've discussed, that key source of authority, which is the Bible. If you find yourself arguing against the idea that the parable of the sower is useful, I mean, if you start critiquing the existence of Christ, you're in big trouble. But I think I still go back to Geneva very often, and this is just a personal story. You know, my family is still based there. I go there, I see the UN, I see the World Health Organization, the idea of this independent city-state. It's one of very few independent city-states. And I feel those roots all the way back to the creation of a sort of safe zone. And we are going to see, as the world gets more dangerous, the rise of city municipal leadership, mayors of major cities taking positions that oppose their own governments. We're seeing that happening in the US already. We're beginning to see that happening in London, particularly if you look at actually what was said after Grenfell. And so I think that is a new era in which we may want to look back to the aesthetic of the Reformation. On periodization and whether chivalric romances are the beginning of the Reformation, there is a sort of running joke, particularly dominant on Twitter at the moment, but amongst academics, there is a general trend that periodization is for idiots. You get a lot of academic snobbery about this, particularly when anyone tries to define the Reformation in the current space. So a friend of mine, John Gallagher, tweeted yesterday that everyone knows that the Reformation began on the 1st of January, 1400 in Florence. And I remember being, just as a student and a graduate student, whenever you take a class with a new tutor, that tutor will tell you that his or her period of expertise in whatever century, in whatever country, is actually the greatest flourishing of human thought and the greatest writers, and everyone needs to take this class. So there's always been a group of medievalists who talk about the 12th century and the rise of Cistercianism and what starts happening in monasteries around that time as a sort of precursor to the Reformation, or maybe even the start of it. You get these sort of running battles. I agree generally with those who are skeptical of drawing huge, big lines. I do think something important happens with chivalric romances that is Celtic. It's something that happens in France, and particularly in Brittany and in Spain before it gets to London, but it also comes through the Welsh. And I think if we look at that sort of slightly rebellious, disruptive use of language, we need to remember that Tyndale was pretty much Welsh. He grows up on the Welsh-English borders. That infects his language. So there is something there, but
Being Welsh isn't a disease.
I don't know. But basically, I would be skeptical of anything that tries to locate the Renaissance or free speech or intellectual rebellion as the possession of a particular place or time or people.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. John?
Yeah, I like what this gentleman said about creative disruption. And I think that if Luther, the Reformation, reminds us of anything, it's the value of it. Whether it's Brexit today or whether it's something else, the importance of disagreement and debate, I think, is absolutely critical. Within Catholicism today, it's interesting, very often it's atheists who say to me, but you can't be a Catholic, because they ascribe to Catholicism a following rules blindly, which is not really Catholicism at all. It's what atheists think Catholicism is, which is not good. I think Catholicism is better defined, as the theologian said, by unity in diversity. And the idea that we can have diverse views, we can tolerate one another. I think there is something important within that really got a special emphasis and a special push from Luther and the Reformation.
So, I mean, that sort of leads me to say, what's gone wrong there? Because, in contemporary society, I was just thinking of something you said, Kate, about critiquing even the existence of Christ. Well, you can't get off base one now without critiquing the existence of Christ in polite society, that's a given, right? Anybody tries to assert the existence of Christ is in for a very unpleasant dinner party, right? So it's gone completely the other way around, in a way. Contemporary Geneva won't have any truck with the deeply religious. There was a case came to court on Friday. There's a guy called Mr. Ngole, who was thrown off his course, Felix Ngole, thrown off his course at Sheffield University 2 years ago, because he posted on Facebook some quotes from Leviticus and said that he, in his opinion, and in Scripture, homosexuality was an abomination and a sin. Right? So he's been thrown off his course, and it's just been upheld by the courts on the basis that he was studying to become a social worker, and that's not going to happen because he would clearly be going around defending gay people. Right? So he and some Christian groups trying to defend him, saying, you know, what's going on here? You're allowing him to think what he wants, but never to say it, which is to send us back to something. I mean, Luther might have been okay with that, but it was the sort of tension I was bringing out, is that you've got moral authority for belief, but we do seem to be living, in some senses, in a society that's got a real problem with people saying some things. Right? There are new forms of heresy, which brings us to the debates about baking gay cakes and not printing business cards for transsexual diversity consultants. There was a case in Southampton recently of a printer who turned down, talking about printing presses, he refused to print business cards for a diversity consultant because he thought, you know, that was just aiding and abetting marginalization of Christians in the workplace. Right? So there are these sort of conscience, modern forms of conscience debate where, as I intimated earlier, so Christians and you know, devoutly religious people, not just Christians, seem to be on the back foot and falling foul of new forms of secular authority. So I just want to throw that out there for the second half of the discussion.
Could I briefly make an observation about the Reformation, which was architecturally and from the point of view of art, very positive, is that one of the things in the Counter-Reformation was to go the other way in terms of decoration of church architecture, because Calvin and the extreme Protestants had stripped every single thing out of all the churches. I mean, I don't think there were even crucifixes, or Kate, who was brought up in Geneva, would be more aware of this. But in somewhere like, for example, Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, the Counter-Reformation there, springboarded by some enthusiastic Jesuits, went completely the other way, and they created Baroque Christian art, where everything went completely over the top. They had huge confessionals, they had pictures, they had ornaments, and I think that was an interesting positive side of the dark, difficult times of the Counter-Reformation.
Hi, yeah. So I thought it was interesting that Luther used religious conscience because it aligned with societal conscience to create social change at his time. Now that religious conscience doesn't particularly align with our societal conscience anymore, is there relevance for Luther's methods within Europe? If not, maybe in the Islamic world, and how does that play forward? Yeah.
Why did Luther do what he did? I don't think he had a choice. The first thing to say about Luther is that he was an anti-rationalist, he was a fideist, he was dogmatic even by religious dogmatist standards. He, I suppose, like me, and forgive if I cause offense, he thought that Christianity was ridiculous also. That was something that he espoused. He said he was anti-rational to the extent that he said that if the evidence of nature disagreed with Christian dogma, then nature itself must be the liar. To be a Christian, one must first pluck out the eye of one's reason. Reason is the devil's whore. It never comes to the aid of spiritual things. Looking back on Luther's writing, looking back on his personality, what I see is scrupulosity. I see the clinical form of obsessive-compulsive disorder. And Luther has been diagnosed after the fact, quite unfairly since he can't defend himself, but quite convincingly if you read the text. He was obsessed with the rules and strictures of his faith. He was utterly inflexible. He believed that he was being persecuted. These are the classic signs of scrupulosity. When Luther says, if indeed he ever said this, I have no choice, he didn't. In the same way that people with obsessive compulsive disorder cannot stop themselves from being compelled to observe the things that keep the devil, in quotes, from their door. That's what I see in Luther. I know it's antithetical to any kind of religious narrative, but nevertheless, there it is. For that reason, I think Luther is interesting, but I think that's why he finds the courage. He finds the courage because he was so driven by that particular kind of psychology. In counterpoint to that, I think King Salman could not be, Prince, isn't he? Prince Salman could not be a more different character than that. He is, of course, overturning the many centuries of alliance between Ibn Saud and Hamad ibn Abdul Wahhab, that they have this political alliance largely of convenience. But his reformation, if it is to come, is one of pure financial expedience. We know why it's happened, because Saudi Arabia is running out of oil, and it needs to diversify. It needs to create a mini UAE within its borders. Otherwise, it'll be bankrupt.
Quickly.
And so, I would see a massive contrast between those two.
No, I think you're on safe ground that Luther and MBS have little in common, but I'm not as convinced that he wasn't actually being persecuted. I think there's some truth to that.
Hi, I'm sorry, I have a couple of points. I'd firstly like to say thank you so much for categorising Catholic consciousness in a really great way that I've been trying to express myself for a really long time. So thanks for that. But my first point is about has too much great man history been written about Luther, and how important are Luther's own theological beliefs that were very highbrow and too intense for most of the general population to understand? And is it more useful, especially when looking at it in comparison today, to look more at what general people and what people on the ground took from Luther's teachings and his own beliefs, and why people then did convert to Protestantism rather than Luther's own very highbrow beliefs himself? And secondly, about the other big thing that was staying around the same time as the Protestant Reformation is humanism, and how much did humanism compared to the Reformation have to do with the expression of freedom of speech, etc.? Because humanism was mostly about humans are conscious beings who can have their own thoughts, which I feel is more inclined to the movement towards freedom of speech than the Protestant belief that all humans are wrong in the first place. So yeah.
This is just going back to when you were talking about Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, and do you think that we credit conscience to Luther because Aquinas' version was more intact with Catholicism and the idea of the catechism, and the fact that Augustine was very pessimistic with his idea of conscience because he believes humans are tainted? So was Luther's idea of conscience just more ideal for people in the time? And is that why people credit conscience to Luther more than Augustine or Aquinas, which were before him?
Just a question about the threads that go from Luther to the later developments, and people have mentioned the paradoxes that Luther would perhaps not be so happy with some of the outcomes. I was just interested in whether the panel might have some comments on the case of Galileo a few decades after Luther, and very often seen as a conflict between science and religion. If you look more closely, Galileo, who always, of course, saw himself as a Catholic, the conflict was really not so much about the motion of the planets around the sun or transubstantiation or other sorts of things, but the authority to interpret Scripture. This was the sticking point for the Church, and as well as the fact that Galileo would basically just not shut up and would write in the vernacular and had a kind of proto-democratic, slightly more kind of free speech outlook. But would Galileo be possible without Luther? Do you see some influence, and do you see this as one of the threads that leads perhaps from Luther through to the Enlightenment in the modern world?
Okay, brilliant, thank you. So I'll bring Kate in for sort of final thoughts.
Okay, briefly, on Galileo, I think I'd like to go back to the question from the gentleman somewhere over here, which we didn't really pick up, on what the Counter-Reformation. and what happens with the Counter-Reformation. For me, one of the tragedies of the 16th century, which should teach us some lessons for today, is that the centre fails. So, I mean, as you were implying, Galileo is the victim of a backlash. I mean, the Copernican system has actually been accepted by various bodies of the Catholic Church long before Galileo, long before it becomes a crunch point and is questioned again by reactionary forces. I feel that there is a point where the Catholic Church could have absorbed internal reform and doesn't, and much later Galileo is the victim of that. It's noticeable, obviously, that many of Luther's greatest triumphs came in the 20th century when we finally have Vatican II. We finally have the abolition of the Index on Prohibited Books in 1966. The policy on indulgences is radically reformed in 1967. I mean, it's taken, 400 years, but the Catholic Church does finally get there and says Luther was more or less right about these things. On great man theories of history, I do think great men or women have key roles to play. I mean, the gentleman who talked about Saudi Arabia gives us the example of al-Wahhabi, although I'd slightly take issue with your characterization of centuries of cooperation between the Saudi authorities and, I mean, Wahhabi dies in 1792 and he only really develops influence later, in the House of Saud, of course, is much later. But there is something about where again I agree with you, is the scrupulosity of Martin Luther, the obsessive-compulsive disorder that I think we do see is exceptional. I would go back to what I said about Erasmus and end on this. Go and read Lisa Jardine's book on the career of Erasmus, and she traces brilliantly the rise of a man who was determined to make a place for himself in the public sphere. And given Lisa's later career as a public intellectual, there's something sort of very self-knowing about the whole book, but I think, yes, there are people who fight their way into the public sphere and make change, and Luther's an example of them.
Brilliant. Dolan?
On rationality, I mean, I think Luther compared reason as a whore, certainly, but then sex is all right within marriage, and reason is all right within the confines of the faith. So he was kind of curtailed in that way. It's certainly true that the Reformation overall is better understood as a religious revival. It was a popular movement. It wasn't just about great men, although it was undoubtedly led by great men. The Catholic historian Delamo actually argued that through the Reformation and Counter-Reformation together should be seen as actually re-Christianization or even primary Christianization of Europe. Basically saying Christianity had never really taken hold in Europe. It formed a kind of compromise with paganism and all these kind of folk rituals and so on. And he thought that in response to the Reformation, the Catholic Church had kind of cleaned up its act. But that's a controversial thesis. It's probably stretching it, but I think there's something in it. In terms of what it means today, I followed a really interesting, slightly bizarre discussion online, a debate about whether Christians should watch Game of Thrones. And what made it particularly surreal is that the side arguing that they shouldn't were quite upfront in saying that they hadn't seen any of Game of Thrones at all, but they were pretty sure that you shouldn't be watching it. And it's very easy in our kind of secular culture to make fun of that and say, well, that's just stupid. How can you condemn something you've never seen? But actually, Christians' own self-image of their faith is childish. It's supposed to be childish, that you resign yourself to God in the way that a child would. And if you're afraid, if you're a bit nervous something might be wrong, then you kind of are on the side of caution. So they wouldn't be shamed by people laughing at them over that. And I think that's really quite interesting because in a very peculiar way, that's one example of how Christians are witness to a kind of another way of life, an otherworldly way of thinking. And I think I kind of want to protect that and not want to mock it too much. I think it's unfortunate that the one thing that sort of stands out about Christianity now is the gay issue. I mean, it might be very important. People then sometimes go say, no, it's not about that, it's about social justice and stuff, but then you kind of sound like a Guardian editorial. There's nothing particularly unique about it. But I think that there is something unique about Christianity and that orientation, that idea of faith. And I kind of think we should protect people's right to be eccentric and a bit odd, because other interesting things could come of it.
No, I think that's fair. I mean, you don't need to watch lots of pornography to know that it's bad for you. I mean, you don't need to watch any to know that it's bad for you, actually. So I'll go along with that. Aaqil, your thoughts?
I suppose we have had when we talk about the impact Luther could have on and today for in the Islamic world, for instance. I suppose you could argue that it's already happened, and it goes back to that old thing about the printing press, which is the Ottomans didn't agree with it. They wanted to control what people read, and access to printing would take that away from them, and they'd seen what had happened in Europe. So effectively, because of that, you don't have that kind of level of thinking which will allow you. And alongside that, they themselves were, no Ottoman. When people talk about the caliphate, no Ottoman the Ottomans were the leaders of Islam for 500 years. No Ottoman caliph went to Mecca to do the Hajj, to do the pilgrimage, which says it all. Yeah. So effectively, that lack of kind of conversation about what religion could mean effectively meant that until the European empire was collapsing, they had no real interest in the Muslim world, and only then did they turn eastwards. And of course, then that's why you have in Saudi, you had rebellions against the Ottomans from what would become modern day Saudi Arabia, etc., going back into the 19th century. So effectively, this has been something that's been going on for quite some time. There's been that conversation in the Middle East, particularly in the Middle East. We should always remember the Middle East is not the Muslim world. It's between 7 and 9% of the Muslim world, and they've always had that. And the most modern, up-to-date definition of this, and we are living in this now, is so when you have Sayyid Qutb, the man who gives us the Muslim Brotherhood, when Sayyid Qutb is being tortured by Nasser's authorities in Egypt, he wonders why a Muslim can do this to him, and of course then goes away with the rationale that, well, these are not proper Muslims. So therefore, if they're not proper Muslims, we have to do something about this, and we have to bring ourselves back to the right path. And Sayyid Qutb, as most people know, then influences many people. His followers influence people all around the world, particularly teaching bin Laden at university. Sayyid Qutb's brother, I think, does that, and effectively giving us an Ayman Zawahiri and all those people that have run Al-Qaeda and have been the graduates of most Islamic-based terrorism in the last few decades are descendants of Sayyid Qutb. So the whole conscience of freedom of expression and freedom of thought, and the belief that my belief is stronger than somebody else's, and I'm going to do something about it, and it's going to be very revolutionary. I think we've already experienced that in the Muslim world.
Okay, and John.
Yeah, did Luther or Aquinas have a better idea of conscience? I think they all had pieces of the jigsaw puzzle with a lot of other people, and putting them together, I think they make a fabulous picture for humankind. Maybe because I'm Team Catholic, I'll go with Thomas Aquinas as having a better idea of conscience, mainly because he said that the law Christians must follow is not in the Bible, and it's not with church authority. It is actually with the self and God. And I think there's something very powerful about empowering the self in that way, rather than looking to a book or authority for approval. Thank you.
Okay, we all thank the panel.